Hello and welcome to our first video on the Baroque period. We are going to be splitting up the Baroque period into three different sections. The first section that we're going to cover this time will cover the introductory section in your textbook, which you see here, as well as the first four chapters. There is a study guide on Blackboard that you can access that looks like this that will tell you what is what important material you need to study for the first quiz on the Baroque period. As you can see up here, it does cover the first four chapters. There is a disclaimer here saying, yes, you need to find some of this information in the introductory pages of the Baroque period. So we're going to use the study guide as a bit of a roadmap for us to cover some stuff. Now you will see the first five questions here in this section. I'm going to return to these. I really want us to start with this question right here, which kind of sets up a time period in which we're talking about. So, what are the dates of the Baroque period? And it is pronounced Baroque. And your textbook in the introductory section does spell out for you why it was called Baroque. There's various philosophies. Not philosophies, but various explanations as to why the word Baroque was chosen. It could mean bizarre, flamboyant, or elaborately ornamented. But that's kind of been lost in history. Nobody knows exactly why we call this period that, but the fact is we do call it the Baroque period. And the dates of the Baroque are 1600 to 1750. So that's the time period in which we're dealing with. You can see a timeline of historical and cultural events. To give you a frame of reference, 1607 was when Jamestown was founded. So, of course, the discovery of the New World and the Renaissance is also, something that's continued into the Baroque period with the exploration and founding of colonies in the New World, or what was the New World to the Europeans. You see that science does advance. Galileo, you've got Newton with his Principia Mathematica, but notice also in 1692 you also had the witchcraft trials, and that's how I would sum up what this period is about: is a good mixture of science and superstition. We're going to see one of the operas we're going to look at, Dido and Aeneas, that was written in this period, actually features three witches that are part of the story. So people believed in witchcraft at this time. It was punishable in many areas of the world. And although we kind of look at that now as kind of a barbaric practice, it was very much a realization at the time. You can also see the King James Bible was published during the Baroque. So when you read Shakespeare, which you can see Shakespeare was still, I believe he lived into the second decade of the 1600s. So he's still alive and writing and stuff. And King James Bible uses also very similar English. So that's kind of what English sounded like at this time. But English is becoming a respectable language with grammar rules and stuff like that forming. So we're going to see some of the first English operas appear during this period. Matter of fact, opera is created in the early Baroque periods, but we'll cover that in our next section on the Baroque period. We're not going to get to opera just yet. But there's some other stuff here if you want to check it out. There's like the 30 Years' War, which started off as a religious war and ended up being kind of a grasping for power among the aristocracy, who were the leaders at this time. The noble class, the elite of the society at this period, were called the aristocracy. So when you hear me say aristocrats or aristocracy, that's who we're talking about. And the place in which they ruled from, and also, their jurisdiction, their place of residency, we're going to refer to that as the court. So when I mention the court, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the aristocracy as well as the physical location that they resided in. Okay. All right, so moving on to the next question. Again, the dates of the Baroque period, 1600 1750, and moving on. Which two kinds of scales and keys became dominant in the Baroque period, replacing the medieval church modes of the Middle Ages and Renaissance? If you remember in our last section, it was on the Middle Ages and Renaissance. There were several different modes that they could use, and each of these modes had its own set of scales and harmonies and stuff, and they do sound quite foreign and exotic to our modern day ears because even modern day pop music like country, western, rap, rock and roll, and stuff like that, they generally stick to the two main modes that are formed in this period. And so the answer to this question is major and minor. I believe the old names for them were Aeolian and Ionian, were the old names for those modes, but those modes emerge as the two dominant modes, and they pretty much dominate music, especially towards the end of the Baroque period and into the classical and all the way up until modern times. Um, Baroque style fills space with blank and blank. And this is one of the questions that you can find in this introductory section. So if you're looking in chapter 1 for that answer, you're going to be a little frustrated. So this is still in the introductory section, and you can see here it says whether you're working with canvas like a painter, stone like a sculptor, or sound, like if you're a musician or a composer, you fill it with action and movement. Action and movement are the answers to this question. Now, we're not going to answer every question on this study guide. That's a lot of that is I'm going to leave up to you. That's your job as a student is to investigate this stuff, and it's my job as a teacher to tell you what I think is the most important information. But we are going to answer a few of them because it's going to guide our coverage of this material. So the answer is action and movement, and then it points out this painting here, which this is a variation of the same painting that you see here in your textbook. It's actually by the same artist, and painters would do this. They would sometimes, paint one version of it and then also paint another version, and sometimes they got their students, the copy their painting to learn from them. But I chose this one because I feel like the artist did a little better in this one. And I like the choice of colors, and it seems like the lighting is a little more crisp and stuff like that. So, looking at this painting here, the name of it is Judith slaying Holofernes, and this is a story from the Apocrypha, which is an extra section in the Catholic Bibles that Protestant Bibles don't have. So this is a story from Old Testament times, and this is a very gruesome story that didn't make it into the Protestant Bible, but you can find it in the Apocrypha. If you look up Judith and Holofernes and on the internet, you can look up the story if you want to, but this is a pretty gruesome event here. You can see she's cutting off the head of this enemy general here, Holofernes, and her maidservant is helping hold him down, and she's cutting his head off. Boy, what a way to wake up, huh? But the question it's asking you about this particular painting is how does action and movement, how is that embodied in this painting here? And you can answer that by asking yourself a few questions like, why did the artist choose this moment in the story? I mean, he could have showed you the action right before it. He could have showed you with her holding the sword over him while he was still asleep, or she could have even shown you, he could even have shown her holding his head after she severed it off. But no, he chose really the climatic moment, the moment of truth where she is starting to dig through, muscle and sinew and a bunch of stuff, and there's blood squirting out all over the sheets and stuff. This is a pretty gruesome, dramatic moment right here, and even the lighting, it's quite dramatic. You have this chiaroscuro that we're going to learn about, which is a contrast between light and dark. And we also see that in Baroque music. Baroque music tends to have extreme contrasts like this. So you see it in artwork, you see it in architecture, and you also hear it in the music. Not only is there an attribute of the action and movement up here, but there also is extreme contrast. For instance, there's not a whole lot of crescendos and decrescendos. It's usually playing a section loud and then playing it quiet, and then playing the section loud and then playing it quiet. And it's almost like the really light colors contrasted with the dark colors in this, which is an Italian word for that. It's called chiaroscuro. It's a high contrast between light and dark. All right, so and you can listen to one of the listening examples that's covered in chapter 3 of this section to hear that kind of contrast in the music. All right, so we're moving on to the second page and final page of the study guide here. Although the church and the courts, and there's that courts that I said I was going to mention, that's referring to the aristocracy. The church is obviously referring to both the Protestant church and the Catholic church. It's referring to the religious structure. The courts are the political structure. So, although the religious structures and the political structures were the major supporters of musicians and composers during this time, what other group of people were becoming a significant source of employment? And your textbook answers this question. Let's see, it's down here, right here. The middle class, which started really kind of appearing in the Renaissance, but by the time we get to the Baroque period, we're going to see, like it mentions here in the Netherlands, there were prosperous merchants and doctors who commissioned landscapes and scenes from everyday life. You can see that the aristocracy, they wanted stuff that was usually kind of like this, that would show like the Greek and Roman gods and stuff like that, because they kind of identified with the Greek and Roman gods. They were rulers, they were powerful people, but they were fallible, and they had made mistakes like the Greek and Roman gods did. And the Greek and Roman gods, if you ever read any Greek mythology, oh my goodness, they were constantly plotting against each other. It was like House of Cards, not House of Cards. Well, a little bit like House of Cards, but I meant to say Game of Thrones, where you have just this constant vying for power and jealousy. And the Greek gods are not like the God of the Bible, who is infallible and perfect. They are very flawed. They're very human-like, but they're powerful. And so, of course, the aristocracy saw themselves in the Roman and Greek gods, and that's why you see a lot of the paintings like this. But of course, middle class people, they didn't identify with the gods. That's one of the reasons why I think when students read Greek mythology, they don't really identify with it as much as, say, the aristocracy. And of course, religious works of art are still being produced for the church and for religious individuals. Here we have Christ's descent from the cross. But you also see a move towards artists. Here is a rare thing that we didn't see much in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and that's a portrait of the artist himself, showing how artists are starting to see themselves as worthy subjects of their own artwork. And here we have a sculpture of that. Believe this is Poseidon overseeing the one of the wading pools here at Versailles, which is a huge court that was built, a huge palace that was built in France. And we're going to see that France, this represents, this is a physical representation of how powerful the French monarchy was. We're going to learn that this period is called the Age of Absolutism because of the move towards the aristocracy being the most absolute powerful organization in Baroque Europe. Before then, it was definitely the church, but by the time we get to the Renaissance, that power is being greatly weakened through the Protestant Reformation, and you even have kings like King Henry VIII in the Renaissance who split England away from Catholicism and established the Church of England and basically set himself up as Pope. And you can read more about that again online if you want to check it out. All right, so let's get back to our study guide here. The answer to this is the middle class. And why is that important? Well, think about how we support artists today. We don't rely on a elite minority to support our musicians today. We don't rely on Bill Gates and people like this that are extremely wealthy individuals to support our artists today. The artists today are supported by the public, and the middle class went from a very small population in the Baroque to being most of the population today. So we're starting to see the middle class begin to want to have art in their life as well and music in their life as well. Now, it really doesn't start blowing up until you get to the end of the classical period. And by the time we get to Romantic, you're going to see artists and composers and musicians and stuff like that pretty much start catering to the public. And we're going to see how that affects the music. All right, next one, Wildest Bach's Fugue in G minor that we're going to cover in chapter 4. Why is it called the Little Fugue in G minor? Well, the answer to that's simple. He wrote more than one in G minor. The little one is the short one. I believe it's under 4 minutes long, so it's pretty short for compared to the other one. All right. A major characteristic of Baroque music is unity of mood. Explain that concept here. Well, first of all, you got to ask yourself, what is mood in music? And I'm going to pull up an example here. When you talk about music having a mood, you generally describe that when you're listening to a piece of music, and you may describe it as the emotion that you experience while you listen to music. Um, we're going to do a little test here. I'm going to play a little bit of the soundtrack from Up, and if you've seen the film, this is probably going to take you back to the scene of in it where I forget the name of the guy. I think it was Carl and Ellie, how they get married and they start a life together and everything. And what I want you to do is try to divorce yourself from that. Try to imagine that this is just pure music that you're hearing, and think about what kind of emotion or mood is established by the clip that I'm about to play. All right, so most of you would probably describe this as upbeat, hopeful, happy. It sounds very carefree. It sounds very energetic. It sounds exciting. Now, I'm going to fast forward it a little bit here, and we're going to see that, music can change. Music can go from sounding fairly happy to sounding a little bit like what we're going to hear here. Let me cut it up a little bit. All right, so yeah, right here. Okay, so listen to this and see if the mood has changed by the end of this piece. Now it's basically the same musical idea there, but with the change of orchestration and the way it's played and everything, it has a whole different feel there, and it sounds a little more somber, or more relaxed. It almost sounds tired. It almost sounds like its fires fizzled out. So this is an example of how music has a mood when you're listening to it. Most of you want some kind of emotional reaction from the music, because music that doesn't tend to give us some kind of emotional reaction, it tends to be quite uninteresting. So, what they strove for in Baroque music, there was a general philosophy behind music, and that is when you start a piece of music, you evoke a mood, you evoke an atmosphere and an emotion. And the Baroque composers they didn't really get to where they were changing gears very quickly. They didn't shift the mood of the music very quickly at all. As a matter of fact, they developed this thing that we skipped over up here called a movement. And the general idea behind a movement is that you didn't have to say the piece of music fully ended when you started a new movement. If you started the first movement, then that could be happy and upbeat. Well, then when you move to the second movement, then it could be slow and sad if you wanted to. And then the third movement could be happy and exciting again. And so the idea behind that is that you're not changing entire pieces of music. But much like a story goes through various emotions, when you first start reading a story, it might sound like, someone going on an adventure and it's exciting and everything, but then that adventure starts proving, you know, hard and they face obstacles. And so it may even seem like your hero is not going to succeed in their goal of going on this adventure. And so times can get dark, they can get sad, but then the hero picks himself up by his bootstraps and carries on and he wins the day. And then that's the basic story arc of most of your movies and stuff. You have characters start relatively happy and then there's some kind of problem they got to solve and then they get over it and then they usually end the movie triumphantly. So composers would structure their music this way, and there are definite stopping points and beginning points in between movements. By the way, if you're ever at a concert and you see that there are movements within a piece of music. And one of the ways, by the way, that you can tell that there are movements in a piece of music is when you get the program, which is a piece of paper that you'll get that describes, what the orchestra is going to be playing or something. It could be an orchestra, it could be a band concert. If you have children and you go see them playing a band concert or something, you may be getting a program and you may see it say something like Suite for Winds or something like that. But the main thing to look for is that it will have Roman numerals underneath the title of the piece, like this. And each Roman numeral will have a name, and this name could refer to the tempo. It could say something like allegro or whatever like that, or it could be the kind of form it is. Like if it's a gavotte, I think that's how you spell it, which is a type of dance that was around in the Baroque period. They can name it after that. There's various things, or even modern day compositions can even give descriptive titles, or romantic pieces sometimes would say things like dream of a witch's Sabbath or something like that. So you could really call the movements whatever you want. But that's how you know they're movements. And if you're ever at a concert, please note that it's not customary to clap in between movements. So it may seem a little rude because if the orchestra or the band or whatever finishes this first piece, it's going to be a little tempting to clap after it because it sounds like it's a definite ending. But you'll notice that the conductor doesn't turn around. They usually just, flip the pages over. They get them ready for the next piece, and then they go right into the next piece. So even though there's a clear division between the first and second movements, it's designed to be listened to as a whole. So the initial idea came from the Baroque period, where they wanted to shift gears emotionally. Now, even though later compositions, like in the first movement, you may go from happy to sad all within the first movement. But later composers stuck with the tradition of separating, drastic changes in the music by movements. So that's what a movement is. And that gets us back to the idea of unity of mood. In a Baroque piece of music like the one I'm about to play you, you will notice that when the piece of music starts, it establishes the mood of the piece. And you'll notice that I'm going to click all across this composition. And no matter where I click, it doesn't really matter. It really kind of maintains the same mood or atmosphere. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this play for a few seconds. And I want you to ask yourself, what kind of mood or what kind of emotion is the guy going for when he wrote this? All right, most people would say that this is kind of a contemplative mood. It's definitely reserved and relaxed. Some people find it peaceful, but nobody's saying that this music sounds like somebody's getting murdered or something like that. I mean, it's way too relaxed for that. But you'll notice that no matter where I click on this, the mood maintains the same general atmosphere. Yes, there are a bit of contrast. Sometimes the harmony clashes a little bit and then it resolves, but there's no dramatic shifts of mood. So I'm going to demonstrate that now. There we go. So it's a little over 5 minutes worth of the same mood. And this is very common in the Baroque period. This is one of the reasons why you see a lot of Baroque music at weddings, because the one thing you don't want at weddings is drama. So if you find a piece of music that's slow and relaxed and doesn't have a lot of drama in it, doesn't have any dramatic shifts of mood, that's perfect for a wedding. Because you don't want if you have a string quartet playing at your wedding, you don't want them suddenly to play something that sounds like, ooh, some kind of drama going on. Now let's compare this to Mozart. Mozart is of the next period of music we're going to look at, which is called the classical period. In the classical period, they began to expound on the idea of what a movement is, and they permitted themselves to explore more than one emotion within a movement or a single piece of music. And so we're going to learn that contrast of mood is an attribute of the classical period. And to show you how much different it is, notice the opening to this piece of music by Mozart and think about what mood it expresses. Now, up to that point, a lot of people would describe that as kind of dark and mysterious, and even a little bit on the violent side there at the end. It kind of got aggressive. But look at where Mozart goes with this. He doesn't maintain that mood throughout the whole piece. As a matter of fact, look at where he goes right after where I stopped. All right, it kind of takes a turn for it being more relaxed and playful. Even it doesn't sound quite as dark and mysterious all of a sudden. So that's kind of where music starts to have some contrast, and is not afraid to do that. But with most Baroque pieces of music, you're going to have that unity of mood. The only exception to that is with Baroque vocal music, because if the vocal music is, say, telling a story or something like that, obviously the music needs to change with the dramatic line of the story. So, but most instrumental music and stuff like that, you're going to find that it stays fairly unified throughout. All right, how were musicians and composers viewed and treated as in the courts of Baroque Europe? Okay, so basically it's asking, where in society are musicians and composers? Well, they're definitely in a much better station than they were in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, where they really were not, especially in the Middle Ages, most were not regarded as, great artists and looked up to and given their just dues for their contributions. However, by the time we get to the Baroque period, we start to have composers really starting to get some recognition and musicians starting to become famous, not just in their local place but abroad. And we also see, because the aristocracy, it was a bit of a status symbol to have the best musicians in your employment and have the best composers. You start seeing musicians and composers that are really good, guys like Bach and Handel and stuff like this. Uh, for the most part, they were very treated very well compared to their Renaissance and Middle Age counterparts. However, they're still seen as servants. They're still seen as most of them. The vast majority of them were not noble class. They were not like the troubadours in the Middle Ages or nothing. So most of them were of low station. Now, Handel's father wanted him to study law and stuff like that, and he was from a little bit better off family than Bach, who came from a whole family of musicians, but they were still seen as basically servants to the aristocracy. And working for the aristocracy at this time. It was because they had such absolute power. It was kind of like going into the military. When you sign up for military service, if you go into the military and you decide it's not working out for you, you don't just quit. You can't quit a military job like you can, say, working at Walmart, where you can just take off your vest and be like, heck with this job, I'm out of here. Because they have a name for that. If you go AWOL in the military, they can actually put you in prison. They can, pretty much make your life extremely difficult. So that's kind of how musicians and composers were. They were contracted by contracts obligated to serve their aristocrats, and you can even see there's an allusion to how little influence and power that they actually had. For instance, it says, for example, the Duke of Weimar could throw his court musician, Johann Sebastian Bach, into jail for a month because Bach stubbornly asked to leave his job. So even asking for a leave of your job could render you in prison. So they still don't. They really don't get the respect and position in society that they kind of really want until we get to the late classical period when we start seeing the political climate change a lot with like the American and French revolutions. All right, so and of course, musicians and composers today, depending on what kind of music they're in, most of them, if you're talking about like popular music, they're pretty much uh, they're not employed to very few rich people. They are supported by us, the public. Individually, us as the public, we can't support them. I can't support, Lady Gaga's lifestyle. I don't make that kind of money, but I can, go on iTunes and for 99 cents download one of her songs. I can afford that. And if you get 5 million people doing that, well, then you got $5 million right there. And so that's how the public's able to support musicians today in pop music and stuff. But back in the Baroque period, you had one guy, it might be a king or a duke or a baron or someone like that that employs a guy like Bach, and they basically just pay his paycheck and they pay the paycheck of the entire orchestra. All right. And by the way, some of the Baroque musicians and composers, if they weren't working for someone pretty big, they usually also had other tasks. You might be a stable boy as well as being a violinist in the orchestra. You might have to sweep and mop the floors when you're not practicing music. So they literally were servants in many respects. Now, this might lead you to ask, well, Mr. Wright, why on earth would these people want to work under such terrible conditions? And there's a question down here about this. What are the three main reasons? Well, here they are listed for you: the pay, the prestige, and the performances of their music. The pay was really good compared to, working jobs outside the court. There was the prestige. Humans are often guided by their egos, and even though the conditions may have been unsatisfactory, there was something to be said if you could say, "Hey, I'm the court composer to, Emperor so and so." That was pretty prestigious position, and you knew that people were more likely to play your music and remember you after death if you were the court composer to some big wig. All right, and performances of their music. Not only just getting your music performed, but getting it performed by some of the best musicians in the world. All right, so moving on. Let me find my place here. Okay, during the late Baroque, blank music became as important as vocal music. Well, instrumental music. Instrumental music becomes very important during the Baroque and begins to rival in importance with vocal music. If you remember, all of the listening examples we had from the Middle Ages and Renaissance were all a cappella. They were all purely vocal. Now we're going to start seeing instrumental music really come into its own. One of the reasons for that is that the orchestra starts to become a little standardized during the Baroque period, and therefore there's some standardization depending on, a composer in Germany would have the same basic ensemble at his disposal as a composer way down in Italy. And part of that are some of the forms, like the concerto grosso that we're going to look at that arose at the time. All right, so the aristocracy were enormously rich and powerful. That's the answer to this one. They were by far the most powerful organization. Even the mighty church, as we said before, um, you know, the aristocracy didn't have to fear the church as much anymore because the aristocracy was really starting to become the most powerful organization. And that's why we call this the age of absolutism, because the absolute power of the aristocracy. All right. Know how many musicians there were usually included in the average Baroque orchestra? Well, this is covered in Chapter 1 when you see the section on the Baroque orchestra. And I believe it lists 10 to 40 would be a normal sized Baroque orchestra. Now, Baroque orchestras, they were significantly smaller than orchestras that we have today. If you look at the Baroque orchestra, you're going to notice that they are about 10 to 40 players, 40 being, about the biggest they had. The average ones were therefore somewhere in the middle, about 20, 25 musicians. And you'll notice that there's not a lot of brass, there's not a lot of percussion. It's mostly strings and woodwinds, and in smaller numbers than you see in a modern day orchestra. You also will notice that this is the only period in the evolution of the orchestra where a keyboard instrument becomes really a staple of the orchestra. We're going to see a few examples of Baroque orchestras here in a minute. And notice how the harpsichord is in both of these groups. The harpsichord, if you need to be reminded of what that instrument is, go back and see the instruments of the orchestra video I did about keyboard instruments. Pianos are not around just yet. The piano was invented in the Baroque period, but it really didn't start to get heavily implemented till the classical period. So the harpsichord is going to, because the orchestra is fairly small and many of the composers, played keyboard instruments so they could, flesh out the harmony and stuff. Some of the best composers of the Baroque were keyboard. They either played the organ or the harpsichord, often both, like Bach and Handel. But it was a unifying instrument because we're going to see when we talk about the basso continuo how they were able to help flesh out the harmony because your orchestra is so small at this time. All right, so once we get to the classical period, the harpsichord is going to disappear almost entirely from the orchestra, and really no other keyboard instrument takes its place. Although the piano takes the place of the harpsichord as a keyboard instrument, pianos don't appear with the orchestra except in like piano concertos and stuff like that. Okay, moving on to the next question, and this is where we get to look at some of these Baroque orchestras. Did brass instruments have valves during the Baroque period? You may recall on our section on the instruments of the orchestra that that's how brass primarily changed pitch, and you will see that this Baroque trumpet right here does not have any valves. Now it does have these little holes here. That are very much like the holes on a woodwind instrument, and we're going to see how those are implemented. Now, sometimes when modern day ensembles play Baroque music, and this is a piece by Bach, so it's from the Baroque period, when they do play it, they sometimes use that piccolo trumpet, which is a modern day invention that has valves on it, allowing it to play in the upper register. Because in order for the natural trumpets, like you see here, to be able to play melodic stuff, they had to play way up in the upper register. So you won't see them playing a whole lot of low notes unless if they're like long sustained notes. When they go to play melodic stuff, it's going to be in a really high upper register. And that's really hard to do on a regular valve trumpet. So they have something called a piccolo trumpet. And I don't want to say it's cheating, but it kind of sort of is cheating. And this is what one looks like and what it sounds like. All right, you see that? He's got valves there that he's using, and you can see he's playing extremely high. And that's because for Bach to get the melody that he wanted, he had to write it fairly high up in the stratosphere range for it to be melodic like that. Now, you saw a modern day oboe being played there. This is a Baroque oboe, and it's more accurate to what they look like back in the Baroque period. And you also will see that a guy's playing a natural trumpet like this, and you will see him use the holes here on it. And this takes a lot more skill, in my opinion, because you really have to squeak out those really high notes. So that's why most trumpet players do prefer the piccolo trumpet. But keep in mind, back in the Baroque period, they didn't have valves like that. Now, of course, this guy makes it look pretty effortless, but like if you watch Michael Jordan play basketball, or at least back when he was in his prime, he makes basketball look really easy. So this guy, is a master at what he's doing. But you can see there's no valves on here. It's just a natural trumpet. And this is one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of brass, because these people, were not very common. They were hard to find. It was hard to find, a whole section of these guys to be able to play. As a matter of fact, in the militaries of that time, people that played these natural trumpets for bugle calls and stuff like that, they were treated as officers on the battlefield if they were ever captured or something, because people had such great respect for their abilities. Okay, so moving on here. We already answered this one, so we'll skip over. And I've already answered this one. The Baroque period is known as the Age of Absolutism due to the absolute control that the aristocracy had over their subjects. All right, the two main organizations, although we did mention that the middle class up here were rising in their employment of artists and musicians and painters and stuff. The two main organizations are the same as it was in the late Renaissance, which is the aristocracy, the court, as well as the church. The church being the Protestant and Catholic branches of that. They both employed artists and musicians. And that's true to this day. Some people make their entire living writing music for church or being church musicians. Some play for churches on the side, and it's additional employment. Which great Baroque composer's death marks the end of the period? That would be Johann Sebastian Bach. He died in the year 1750, making his death very convenient to memorize if you know your dates of the Baroque period, which are 1600 to 1750. All right, the dominant section of the Baroque orchestra was the blank family, and that would be the string family. If you go back and you look at this Baroque orchestra here, you can see that. Let's find a good group shot here. You can see that it is mostly strings. You have just a few non-string instruments here, and again, you have the harpsichord over there. Same as this group here, because they're playing the same piece of music. Although you will notice that with this group, the harpsichord seen here actually has a more standard position in the orchestra. It's pretty standard in these Baroque orchestras to have the harpsichord somewhere in the middle or in the front of the group. And you can see this one's not stationed off to the side like in the other one. So you can see it's mostly strings, mostly, you got your violins, violas, cellos, and basses. And that's pretty standard for Baroque orchestras. You expect a lot of strings when you listen to Baroque instrumental music. And of course, they're going to be the ones mostly accompanying singers too. Now, you do have the keyboard instruments of the harpsichord and the organ, which were also used a lot in the Baroque period. For instance, when we get to Bach's Little Fugue in G minor, that's played entirely on the organ. All right, and the last one here, Baroque period. People demanded new music, just like we do today. Especially think about like how young people today, just like young people always have, they want the new music. Man, don't play me something that's 20 years old or something like that. They don't have much interest in that. Of course, you always have classics that seem to defy time. There's music that was written 40, 50 years ago that still is popular today. Not not as popular as the new stuff, though. I mean, you see how many times modern artists today, that are dominating the pop charts today, they definitely get more airtime than somebody who was popular 40 years ago. But this is the reason why we have, like classic rock stations and stuff like that. So, and hip hop's getting old enough now where you have classic hip hop stations. I never thought I'd see that day. I remember when hip hop first really started coming on the scene, and of course we called it rap back then. But and people still call it rap. But if you ever hear someone say hip hop, rap, it's all basically the same thing. But of course, some hip hop artists like Will Smith have kind of abandoned it and gone on to make movies, and who can blame them? They make good money in that. All right, so just a few things about these that I skipped over. Now, I'm not going to go much into the fugue and the concerto grosso. For that, what I ask you to do is just go on the Blackboard, go into the videos section, and once there, you'll see there's a folder on the Baroque period. And I have the video that explains what the concerto grosso is and what the fugue is. Um, and so watch those, read the sections in your textbook, which are chapters 3 and 4, respectively. Chapter 2 is, as you saw there, was on what music was like in that period and what was life like for these musicians. Chapter 3 is on the concerto grosso and ritornello form, which sound like a bunch of boring stuff, but actually, if you look at it and read it, it's pretty easy to figure out. It's got big, fancy, confusing Italian names, but really it's a very simplistic thing to follow. It basically ritornello form is basically having one group, the tutti, the big orchestra, play against a small group of musicians, and they just kind of take turns like a musical conversation. And it's so easy to follow. It really, I think a lot of people they get hung up on these foreign words that we have in classical music and stuff, but really it's most of the stuff is very simple to listen to. And if you just figure out what you should be listening to, then it becomes very enjoyable to listen to this stuff. And again, I really don't care if you like listening to this stuff. That's not my job here. My job's not to get you to like Bach or to like Vivaldi. I do want you to appreciate it though, and I want you to see how the groundwork that was laid down by these guys really helped set the stage for the music that we have today and Western culture. All right, one thing I do want to point out though is this basso continuo, or sometimes called figured bass. This can be a bit of a confusing term because this sort of refers to a notation style, which is how we write down music, and it also refers to a battery of instruments that you find in most Baroque music. So I'm going to try to explain this a little better, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to bring up some, if I can spell, some figured bass notation here. And you can see this also in your textbook, an example of this. This is figured bass notation here, where, actually, let me find one that doesn't have the notes written over it, because, yeah, this is more accurate here, where you have just a bass line. And that's how you're going to know it's figured bass, is you're going to see just a bass line here, and then you're going to see numbers written underneath it. Now, to the untrained person, these numbers mean nothing, but to the trained musician, this would be standard training in the Baroque period. If you were training to be a musician or a composer, you would understand what these numbers mean. And it basically tells you what chord to play above these bass notes. In Baroque music, the bass line is very strong. It's almost like a secondary melody in and of itself. If you remember from this piece of music I played, let me play a little bit more of it for you. And if you didn't notice last time, notice how musical and how important this bass line is. Man, that bass line is almost like a second melody, hopping around there in the bottom part. So, because the bass lines were so important, and most of the composers, they knew the melodies, and they would just write out the bass line. The bass line was the important thing for you to hit if you were like playing harpsichord. Now, of course, this is notation that you would only use for like harpsichord or organ or lute or some instrument that could play chords. You would never write this for cello. Because a cello, although you can double stop and triple stop and play multiple notes, they would just play primarily one note at a time. So a cellist would see this bass line, but they wouldn't see the numbers underneath. So the cello player would play this bass line. Meanwhile, the harpsichordist would also play this bass line, but then they would be fleshing out the harmonies above it and playing chords. Now, notice the composer doesn't tell them exactly how to play the chord. And this is why you do see some variation in performances of a lot of Baroque music, because it's up to the performer to decide how they flesh out those chords. This is very similar to what we call lead sheets in modern day notation. A lead sheet would take a song like this, like "Oh Susanna," and you notice the melody is here. Ba ba bum 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 ba dum bum bum ba dum bum 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 bum. The melody's there, and if I were playing this on piano, I would play this probably with my right hand, and then there's a G here. Notice it's not numbers like in figured bass, but there's a G there, and that means to play the G chord. Notice it doesn't tell me what specific notes of the G chord to play. So I could play that as just standard block chords, or I could, flesh it out into an arpeggio or something like that. I could play it, tremolo. I could. There's all different ways I could play that, and so two different pianists would play the same melody. They would still play ba ba bum 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 ba bum bum bum, but the harmony they play with it would be different depending on what creative choices they made. So as long as they played the right chord, like play a G chord here, an F chord there, and so forth like that, then that's how lead sheets work. And so think of figured bass as far as the notation system of figured bass or basso continuo. Think of that as like the Baroque equivalent of lead sheets. And lead sheets are very popular in like pop music and jazz and stuff like that. Now, as far as the actual instrumentation of figured bass, you would have a bass instrument and then you'd have a harmonic instrument. A bass instrument would play the bass line. So if you had like a cello playing the bass line, like in this example I'm about to play you, you would also have a harpsichord or an organ or some kind of instrument that could play chords, like a lute or something like that, playing the chords above it. And I'm going to play you a little sample of this because you can hear the figured bass playing the accompaniment. Don't listen to the melody. The melody's played by another instrument. We're going to listen for what sounds like a cello playing the bass line and then a harpsichord playing the chords. So what you should have heard is the cello playing the bass line there, and then the harpsichord was filling out the chords above it, and that's basically what a basso continuo sounds like. Okay, I'm just making sure I've covered everything I want to here. So that's basically what basso continuo or figured bass sounds like. We're just about running out of time because I like to keep these underneath an hour in length. Now, the rest is up to you to fill out. Like I said, on the fugue and the concerto grosso, watch the videos that I have in the video section in the Baroque folder. So the other videos listed here, we're going to get to those as we progress throughout the Baroque period. So remember, we're stopping at chapter 4, and that's what your quiz this week is going to be on. So be sure to look at the study guide. Make sure you read through the first 4 chapters. This chapter, chapter 3 here, will explain to you what the concerto grosso is, everything you need to know about it. And then chapter 4 deals with the fugue. And then you have your example, which is Bach's Little Fugue in G minor. So I hope you have learned a lot. Be sure to email me with any questions or any things that were not clear in the video. Maybe you need me to explain them a little better. So feel free to email me with that, and I'll see you guys next time where we cover a few more chapters in the Baroque period. Again, there's going to be 3 units to the Baroque period, this being the first. So see you next time for the second unit.